the first of the resources that I am quickly just going to show is just our Learn site. And so we're getting into, we've seen some introductory to Ruby stuff, right? We've done this for the last few weeks. We looked at basic Ruby, OO Ruby, building our own classes. We looked at some test-driven development. We went over our test-driven object-oriented code last week. You've had an opportunity to do a challenge now where you're using the active record library to interact with the database. And we're now getting to the point where we're going to actually start investigating Rails proper. And so inside of the notes, the notes that follow this fairly nicely are going to be the notes that are labeled Rails hints and tips. And so if you go to the Rails hints and tips, you'll see these notes right here, and they basically give us a nice introduction to Rails. I'm not going to go over them piece by piece because we're going to look at individual portions of them as we work through the stuff today. But this is your source along with the Rails guides. So remember, we've got guides.rubyonrails.org. This is your source of notes and sort of reference material that you should be going to before you start Googling. So Googling for stuff around Rails, there's nothing wrong with that. But just like any bit of technology that's been around for a while, you have to be very aware if you're looking at a response that is dealing with an older version of Rails, and Rails has now been out for a decade, right? So you have to really make sure that the tutorials that you're following are fairly new, right? So anything within a year is pretty good. Anything within the current Rails version is of course great. We're in Rails 6. Rails 5 wasn't a huge change in terms of backwards compatibility breakages. Was sort of newer stuff added to Rails 6, but the further you go back by major version, the more likely you are to get to things that are no longer either the way of doing things in Rails or just things that won't work in the current versions of Rails. So again, Ruby on Rails guides. Your challenge this week is this getting started with the Rails guide. We'll go over the challenge a little bit later, but you're basically walking through this getting started tutorial that sort of walks you through building a Rails application with a few models. That's what I'm going to do today, is also sort of start a Rails application and walk you through that process. And some of the commands I'll be running are outlined in this Rails tips and tricks section. For example, the very first command that we're going to run today to start up our new Rails project is going to be the Rails new command, followed by the name of the project that we are working on. So that's where things are going to kick off. And the other thing I want to do before, maybe I'll fire that off in the background, is sometimes that takes a while to run that command, especially if I'm running on a different version of the Windows subsystem for Linux than you are. So mine, I believe, acts a little bit faster in some ways in terms of file system access than what you might be operating on. So if you're going to try to code along with me, we're going to start things off today. The other thing that you might notice is that typically when I start my terminal, I'm in my tilde directory, which is like my home folder within the Windows subsystem for Linux, whereas you are likely storing your files, within your Windows subsystem. So you likely go to either like /mount/c and then some subfolder within there. My recommendation is just write off C to give yourself a full stack folder and put all of your code into that folder. Or you might, say, okay, my C drive is getting a little bit filled up. You might go to /mount and you might have a D drive and you might have a full stack folder off of that. I'm working in, if I run the present working directory command, I'm running in just my home folder for my user on the WSL. And I do that with the WSL2 because things actually don't work very well when you're using a Windows mount in the second version of the WSL. You get far faster file access if you are working within the sort of the native file system. So in case you were just wondering why my paths look a little bit different than yours, that is why. I'm going to navigate. I've got a programs folder where I've been storing my code. I'm going to go into this Ruby folder right here, and I'm going to say Rails new, and I'm going to create a new project. called beers on rails. We're going to model some tasty beers today. If you're not a fan of beer, I apologize for my choice of example data. I think I already have from the other section a beers on rails, so maybe I'll just have to put the number 2 after mine. You won't need that number 2 there, and that'll just give me a slightly different project compared to the one that I've got going with the other section. So I'm just going to run that command, and we'll let it do its thing in the background. Yeah, what are we going to do now? The application is ready. It's sitting over here and it's ready to go. So I'm going to go to VS Code. I'm going to add a folder to my workspace, and I'm going to, I got to go to my home, and you're going to have to navigate to wherever you've run that. Typically, if you're still working in the Windows file system, you go to show local, and I'm going to go to my Ruby here, and then I've got this beers on Rails 2 that I'm going to pull in here. Oh, I don't want that right now. So a few things to make note of. I find that sometimes, and I think I've mentioned this before, but I'm going to mention it again because it's crucial. Sometimes VS Code will bump you out of the VSL mode or the WSL mode. And so you got to always make sure in the bottom left-hand corner here that you see WSL Ubuntu. And if you don't, that's going to bump you out. And the question here was, what Rails command did I run to do this? I'm just going to copy and paste this into the chat here. And so it was Rails new, and then, oops, Rails new beers on Rails. And I had a 2 there, but that was only because I already had another beers on Rails folder, so I can remove that and change that back to Rails new beers on Rails. So that was the command that I executed. And then we'll see here, this is the same file folder structure that every Rails application has. And this is the other nice part about working with a framework, whether you're working with Rails or Django or whatnot, the layout, the structure, the files, the folders, they're always the same. Whereas if you're going to a project that is built without a framework, it's going to be very ad hoc. It's going to be sort of just different for every single project that's built without a framework. And you'll even see these in the frameworks that are sort of like micro frameworks. So when you're working with like Sinatra or Flask or Express, they aren't as opinionated as to where things go and the file folder structure, and there's not as many conventions as those. So you'll come to a project with one of those micro frameworks, and it'll be much more different from project to project. But when you're working with a much more opinionated framework like Django or Laravel or Rails, then you'll see the sort of the same file folder structure in every project. And I like that. It sort of feels like home. When I come to a Laravel project that someone else has built or a Rails project that someone else has built, I know where to look for the various pieces of the project. I know that in my app folder, I can look for my models, and I can look for my controllers, and I can look for my views. And in the config folder for Rails, I can go and I can look at my routes. So that it's sort of nice to know that every project is sort of structured in the same way. So I've pulled up a file here, and I just want to just sort of write down the kind of project that we wish to build here. And we're going to make a project that's going to have, I'm going to close this, I'm going to close the terminal for a second as well. We're going to have a few models, and initially I'm just going to have one model, and we'll bring in a related model later on. But we're going to start with one single model, and that's going to be the model of a company. And it's going to turn out it's going to be like a brewery, but we're going to keep it a little bit generic to begin with, and it's going to just be a company. And in our mind, we can think to ourselves, if this is a model called company, that maps to a database table named companies. Right, so that's the convention that we're working with, the Rails convention, that the model name is the singular noun, it's capitalized or camel case if it's multi-word, and then it becomes lowercase and pluralized. And Rails understands the fact that when something ends in a Y, it becomes IES as the pluralized thing. And this is going to be a very simple model. It's going to have an ID, which is our auto incrementing primary key. Every company is going to have a name, and this name is going to be a string. Every company is going to have a created at, and that's going to be a timestamp, and a updated at, which is also a timestamp. And then we're going to just start with that. The eventual goal is to bring in a second model, and the second model is going to be a model for beer, and that maps to a database table named beers. Again, the plural, it's a much more regular plural here. We're just adding S to beer. And a beer is going to have, just like the company, an auto incrementing primary key, a name, which is a string, maybe in this case a price, which is decimal, maybe a description, which is going to be text. And the difference between string and text is going to be like within the database, a string is going to be a varchar column, whereas text is going to be a text column. And then we'll also have our created at timestamps and our updated at timestamps. So we're gonna start in a little bit of a different way than when I gave you my very first demonstration of Rails. When I did my very first demonstration of Rails, I leaned heavily on scaffolding. In this demonstration, I'm going to start out creating things a little bit more manually and then bring some scaffolding in at the end to accelerate the development. But I want to do things a little bit more manually so that it's not so magical, right? When we use scaffolding, just everything was just built for us, and we didn't have to stitch any of the pieces together ourselves, and you lose a little bit something on the conceptual level when it's all automatically built for you. So when we build out our company model, we're going to build that manually. We're going to manually build the controller and the associated views. We're going to rely on some generators. So there's going to be a little bit of generation for us, but it's not going to be wholesale. The model view, controller, and routes aren't going to be made for us all at once. So we're going to start with the company. Once we get that up and operational, then we're going to use scaffolding to bring the beers in. Oh, and I realized I missed one other thing here, is that these beers are going to have an association to that company. And so there's going to be a company ID, and this is going to be, like, that ID will be an integer, but really what it's going to be is a foreign key. And so that company ID is going to map to a particular company. So there's going to be a one-to-many association where a beer can belong to a company, and a company can have many beers that it makes. And so that's going to be, that's why we're starting with the company. I want to start with the company so that by the time I create the beer, there will be companies already that I can associate to. And again, some of the Rails conventions are already starting to surface. So we saw that we're relying on the convention of the mapping to the particular names of our database tables. But the other conventions is like in Rails, we always have a auto incrementing primary key that is called ID. It's always just called ID. And our foreign keys are always just the name of the thing that we're mapping to underscore ID. So we went over that when we first looked at Active Record. I just want to sort of reinforce that. And then again, we get for free, we don't have to make these or update these. They created at and updated at timestamps. Those sort of just come for free, and it's Active Record that manages those for us. If we look at the routes that we're going to want to create, I'm going to want to, at least initially when I'm working with my company. Oh, and I see Travis, you have your hand up. Do you have a question before I get onto the routes?
Yeah, I was just wondering, like the stuff in the brackets, is that like required, or are those just like comments?
Yeah, so all of this that I'm writing right now, like just think of this as like a text file. None of this is actual executable code or anything related to Rails. This is me really just mapping out in my sort of scratch pad here what I wish to develop.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, none of this is actually related to, that's right, Brody. This is documentation. This is me writing some docs for sort of what I wish to build here. So these are like my design docs, my text file design docs. And so before I continue though, does anyone else have any questions? Thank you for allowing me to clarify that, Travis, because I'm sure you weren't the only person thinking that. Okay, so some of the routes that I want associated with this company is I'm going to build 2 of those manually. When we get to the beer model, we're going to allow Rails, because it's going to be scaffolded for us, we're going to get the full suite of CRUD, which is our 7 RESTful routes, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But we're going to manually create 2 routes to work with company. We're going to have one which is a GET request to /companies. And we're going to want that to go to the company's controllers index action. And so I'm using a little bit of a short form of sort of naming this. So you can, when you see this get in all capitals, that is like an HTTP GET request. This is the path, the thing that would follow the domain name. And then I'm using this little arrow, again, just as documentation, as like maps to. So this route here, a GET request to /companies, will map to, and then my short form here is like, this is the name of the controller, and then after the hash mark, this is the name of the action. And I'm gonna want 2 different GET requests here. One that looks like this first one, a GET request to /companies, and what I want this to do is I want it to like load and display all companies. And this other one here, which is a GET request to /companies /some identifier, some numeric identifier. So this might be a GET request to /companies /12 or /companies /1. And I want this to go again to the company's controller, but this time to a show action. And the idea here is I want it to load and display a single company by ID. Make sure this all stays on the screen. This is going to compare to the, what's going to be present for my beers when I scaffold the beers out. We're going to get a lot more things going on there. I won't go over those just yet because I don't want to overly complicate things. So just know that the beer scaffold and the associated routes and views and controller, that's all to come. But right now we're going to focus on this company model and these 2 routes. And I've purposefully picked 1 route from each of our main types of routes. And so in Rails, we have some routes which are called collection routes. And these are routes that deal with a particular collection as a whole. And so this first one here, the GET companies, that is a collection route because it's dealing with the company's collection, which in this case happens to be the company's database table. And so that's working with the entire collection. We're going to show all companies. The other kind of route we have collection routes and member routes. And every member route has an ID placeholder in it because we're sort of pinpointing a single member of a collection. So in this case, if I had in my database, if I had 12 different companies and there was one in there that had a primary key of 3, I would load it up by going to get /companies, or I'd make a GET request to /companies /3. So this little colon ID, just think of that as a placeholder for an ID, a placeholder for some primary key that actually lives and exists in the company's database table. So this is our collection route, or an example of a collection route, and this is going to be an example of a member route. And that will give us the ability to sort of show how to build up the associated actions for something that is collection related compared to something that is member related. Okay, so this file, I will save this file here. And all of this code I will eventually put up on GitHub for you as well. So if you're not coding along, you'll definitely be able to get this code on GitHub when I post the video associated with it as well. Let's do this. Where am I saving? No, I don't want to save it there. I want to save it into the folder where I'm working. I guess I'm not working in a folder yet. Okay, well, Beers on Rails 2, and then I will call it my beer plan.txt. There we go. So I'm just navigating to my folder. And from my terminal here, I'm going to run the Rails server. And I'm going to do that mainly just to make sure that Rails is up and running. And then I'm going to keep that server going, that we can sort of access it and, you know, sort of watch our application get built and tested interactively by using the browser. So we run Rails server to bring up the server, or we can shorten that to Rails S. And here is our browser, and I can go to localhost :3000, and it tells me, yay, you're on Rails. And I can see down below here, we can see that the server has fielded a GET request to / sort of the root route, and it has processed the built-in welcome controller. So that's, we're going to override that later on, but for now, when we go to that root route, we just get this nice little welcome message. So I'm going to leave the server running here, and I'm going to click the plus here to open up a new server, so that I now have 2 terminals. So with this little drop down here, I can go back and forth between, am I at my server or am I at a terminal where I can actually type things out? Because when the server's running, although I can type here, it's in a little server loop, so I don't want to actually interrupt it. It's doing its thing on that separate terminal. So what else do I want to, my plan here is not fully complete, right? I've got this idea that I want make a company model, and I want some routes, but what are these routes going to? They're going to particular controllers, right? So I'm going to need a controller, and the first of these controllers is going to be a company's controller. And this controller is going to have 2 different actions. One action is going to be index, and the other action is going to be show. And as I said here, we sort of mapped out already sort of what these are going to do. The index is going to load all of the companies, and the show is going to load up a single company, and it's going to hand those off to associated views. And so there's going to be 2 views that I'm going to be working with here. We're going to have one view for the action, or for the index, and it's going to be found in the app views companies folder, and it's going to be called index.html.erb. And there's going to be another view, and this is going to be for the show, and it's going to be called app views companies show.html.erb. So we almost always, at least in the basic cases, have a view associated with each one of our actions. Once we get to the scaffolded beer model, we're going to see that there are certain actions that don't have views associated with them. An example of that will be like the delete action. The delete action just needs to delete the thing that you want deleted, and then what would it show? There's nothing left to show, so it's just going to redirect elsewhere. It's probably going to redirect back to maybe the index and maybe display a little status message, but it doesn't have a view associated with it. So the 2 views that we're working with right now, they both map to actions, but actions don't need to have views. They just do in the more typical of cases. So these are the things I need to build now. This model, this controller, these views, and these routes. I'm going to start with the model. And so I'm not going to use scaffolding, but I am going to use generators. And so I'm going to use a generator to generate the model. So I'm going to say Rails generate, and I can just shorten that to Rails G. And what do I want to generate? I want to generate a model. What do I want to generate a model for? The company. So I'm going to write company here. And a company, other than the things that we get with every single database table, like the ID and the created at and the updated at, the thing that is unique to a company here is this column right here, the fact that the company has a name, which is a string. So I'm going to type that right in here, name : string. I don't need to mention the ID. I don't need to mention these timestamps. Those are going to get built for us automatically. The other thing that gets generated here along with our model is what's called a migration. And this is what's actually going to generate the company's database table in our database. So when we were working with Active Record in class last week and in the challenge, I provided you a database that already had the database tables in it. But now we're at a state where we're at a sort of a fresh Rails application. The database is completely empty. And so when I run this generator, it's going to generate a model and it's going to generate a migration. You've likely seen migrations in the context of MVC.NET. And again, that's an idea that came right from Rails. And it's sort of this idea that we can have a file which is code that represents atomic changes to our database. So how the database changes over time, and those things then get captured into version control and shared out to the entire team. So if you're working with a big team, you can make a change to the database and then share those migrations with everybody else on the team through your Git repository, and then everyone's database, whether it's production databases or development databases, they all stay in sync by way of the migration. So it's a really, really handy thing for teams. So I'm going to run that generator, Rails G model company name : string, and you can see here's the migration that got generated, and here is the model itself. So the migration ends up in the db migrate folder, and it's the create companies migration. It starts with a big long timestamp. So if you look at that, it's like 2020-09, so like the year, month, day, and then some type of time stamp as well. And then in the app models folder, we now have a company model. So let's go look at both of those. Because again, that there's just so much to Rails, one of the things that I don't teach going forward is we got like a little taste of test-driven development last week. But I don't go into all of the testing capabilities of Rails. Rails assumes that you will be doing testing, so when you create a model, it automatically in the test folder creates some test facilities for you, but we aren't going to dig into those any deeper this term. So I'm going to open up in the DB folder, in the migrate folder, that migration here. And then yes, the YAML is there is YAML, yet another markup language, and it's sort of scattered around Rails projects. So you'll see even in the config folder, like the way we configure the database is a YAML file. YAML was a very common sort of configuration language in the Ruby community for quite a while. And then I'm going to go to the app models folder, and I'm also going to open up the company here. So this is an active record model. It looks a little different from the active record models we were working with last week, and it is different because when we were working with active record last week, we had our class inherit from active record : base. But if you look here, we are inheriting from, and remember this is the inheritance sign in Ruby, from something called application record. But that is not so mysterious. When you look here and you look at the model folder, you'll see that there is a file right in there called application record. And if we open that up, you will see that it is what inherits from active record base. So why this one level of indirection? Well, we now have a little place to hook in stuff that we might want to be common to all of our models. If every single model inherits from application record, that means we can put stuff in the application record class that then gets shared across all of our models, and then that application record class in turn brings in active record base. So it just sort of adds one more level to the object hierarchy. That's cheap to do in a highly object-oriented language like Ruby, and then it gives us a place to hook in common code that can be shared across all of our models. So if you look at your...
It's kind of like the AR file, right?
You got it, right? It's almost our equivalent of that AR file. Much more simple here. All of the loading up of the database and everything, that's sort of happening behind the scenes, but it's our way of hooking into active record. And then this migration here, you can see it is called create companies. That just came from what we sort of made a request for here at the command prompt. It's inheriting from something called active record migration. And every migration either includes two methods, one called up and one called down, like what change is being made is the up and how to revert that change is called down. Or if the change is easily auto reversible, we just have a method called change. And so this change method includes inside of it the statement that we're creating a table called companies, and that is going to have our standard timestamps. So if we didn't want the created and updated at, we could just take that away, but we do. And it's going to have a column by the name of name that is of type string. We can't change the auto incrementing primary key. That's just built in. We probably could. There's probably some way of hooking into create table to change that, but that goes against sort of a fundamental thing that sort of all Rails tables are sort of always have that ID in there. So it's best not to mess with that, even if we could. And so how do we run this migration? We run it from the command line. We say Rails db:/migrate. So Rails can run various tasks for us, like our generators, but it can also run tasks that are related to specific things. So there's a whole bunch of database tasks that can be run, and they are all prefixed with db:. And the one that runs migrations is db:/migrate. We can run it, and it will find us the most recent migration. We could also say it's something like db migration or db migrate version equals, and we could put one of these timestamps in. And it will either migrate up to that particular migration, or if we've already run a bunch of migrations, we could say db version, and we could put a migration in the past, and it will run the migrations in reverse, undoing the changes of the migrations, going back in time, all the way down to version 0, which will bring our database back to a complete blank slate. And so it's really nice to be able to migrate up and down, especially if you're working on a large project where you might have deployed out maybe for different customers, different versions of the applications that are actually at different like version numbers. And maybe one of your clients is running on version 2.3 of your software, and another client is already on like 4.6, and you need to go back and make a bug fix for that 2.3. Well, by way of your Git repository, you can get the code back to that old version, but by way of your migrations, you can actually back your database up to what it looked like at the time of that earlier version. So migrations are super handy in that way too. Not only in that they allow you to synchronize the database for the team, but they allow you to sort of go back in time to a previous state of what your database looked like. And so I'm going to run Rails db migrate.
And so that will essentially bring in the table that we created into the schema. Because without that, like, it won't actually like bring it into the database, correct?
You got it. Without running that command, there would be no companies table in the database. And right now we're just using the default, which is to use SQLite 3. And so if we looked in the DB folder, we would now see that there's this development.sqlite 3. And if I had the SQLite 3 extension installed, we could then investigate the contents of that development SQLite 3, and we would see that there's now a companies table, and that companies table would look like this one right here, this idea that has an ID and a name column and a created at and an updated at. But without running Rails db migrate, that table would not exist in this development.sqlite 3 database. And so that's also like whenever we deploy a Rails application, if we were deploying to a production environment, you always run migrations as part of your deployment pipeline, because you want to make sure that the database in production is going to match the latest version. So like if the developers that have been working on the product have added new tables or changed tables in some ways, you'll always run the migrations as part of your deployment to bring the production database in sync with the latest version of what the database needs to look like. Bring in new tables, change existing tables, add columns, rename columns, all those possibilities. And so how do we know that this actually worked, that we now have a model called company? Well, we can run another command from the command line, which is Rails console. And again, we can shorten that down to Rails C. And at the Rails console, I should being the operative word, be able to go to company, as in our model, and do .count. And that's going to do a select star from companies. And so that's our, that's basically working with this company active record model. So when we're at the console, it is an interactive Ruby prompt. It's very similar to typing IRB at the command prompt and just being able to execute Ruby code. So, anything that is valid Ruby code, I could put here and it would execute any Ruby code at all. But I can also, my environment is brought up to the point where I actually have access to my models and I have access to my development database. And so I could even go in now and create a new company. I could say company.create name, and I could say like, I need to make this in quotes, Kyle likes beer, so Kyle makes beer, which is the name of my beer brewing company that I have running out of my backyard. And so if I do that, it'll say insert into companies, and we now have a row in our companies table. So when I do a company.count, it now tells me that I indeed have one company in there. And if I said like company.first, it shows me that company. And notice it's auto inspecting the objects that come out. So I don't have to, save company.first to a variable and do a .inspect. It just automatically inspects that object for me. And so Brody was asking, yeah, can we also inspect it? We definitely can, but it sort of auto inspects whatever it gets returned here. So that's handy. That gives us like a nice way to interact with the database, right? So we can put some initial data into the database. So I can create another company here. This is like my arch nemesis company, which is like we pretend to make tasty beer, but actually our beer is nasty. And that's the company that I don't drink their beer. I only drink the beer from my company. But now we at least have two companies in my database, right? So when I do a select star or a select count star, it tells me two, and I could ask for company.last, not that, but last, and it would show me that company there as well, with it created and updated at timestamps, ready to go. So that's good. That means my model is working. So hooray, that's good. So we were sort of doing check marks here. We know that the server is operational. The model and the database we now know are operational. I now need to dig into the controller and the views. And so I need a company's controller. Again, leaning on Rails conventions here, we tend to name the controller after the collection it's interacting with. And in our case, the collection that's being interacted with is this database table called companies. And so we're going to call it a company's controller. And we're going to generate that again from the command prompt here. We're going to say Rails G for generate controller. And this time we're generating a company's controller. And we already know that we are going to want to make two actions and have two views associated with those actions. So I could just hit enter now, but because I know I need an index action, and because I know I need a show action, and because I want views associated with each one of them, I can just say index and show. And so that'll put method stubs into the controller for those actions, and it will actually make these two view files in the right places. So it's going to make me a company subfolder inside of views, and it's going to make for me an index.html.erb and a show.html.erb. And so you can see here, there is the company's controller being created in the controllers subfolder of the app folder. Here is the company's folder being created in app views, and then those two views being created. And just like with models, we get some test files created, and we also get a style sheet that is put in an assets folder for styling the view associated with, or the views associated with this company's controller. I'm going to open those files up now. So I'm going to close some of the other files. The question is, what is SCSS? Yet another new technology that we're going to be looking into. I mean, it's not new in terms of internet years, but it's probably new for a lot of you. SCSS is a CSS variant. It's a CSS preprocessor. So you write code in SCSS, or Sass it's sometimes called, and that compiles down to regular CSS. Eventually, the goal of SCSS is to not exist. So the goal is for the ideas from SCSS to eventually make their way into CSS, and this is already starting to happen. So in the early days of Sass or SCSS, it added things like variables for CSS. Well, we now have custom properties in CSS, so we can make variables in CSS without Sass. But Sass also, yes, Sass is sassy. It also gives us the ability to have what are called mix-ins, which are like functions for CSS. So it augments CSS. It's baked right into Rails. It's very, very popular, not only in the Rails world, but also in the JavaScript world. So a lot of people use SCSS to style their React components. So it's just, it's a nice little thing. And I'll go into it in more detail, but not today. Not today. We're going to keep things as simple as we can today. So I'm now opening up in my app controllers folder. I'm opening up the company's controller, and you can see there's the index and show method stubs that are in there waiting to be populated. In the app views companies subfolder, I've got my index and show views that I can open up. And you can see there's a little bit of markup inside of each one of them that basically just mentions the name of the controller and the action that it's associated with, company's index and company's show, and then where it can actually be found. So that if we were loading these up from the browser, we would know where we needed to go to edit the markup in question. And then the last thing I need to open up here, right, because we're working with the controller, the views, we also need to work with the routing file. And the routing file is in the config folder. So I'm going to close that app folder, and we're going to look in this config folder, and we can see that there is a routes.rb file, and we want to open that up. The generator that generated our company's controller put two actions into here, or two routes into here, but I don't want those. So I'm just going to get rid of them. I'm going to want to make those myself. So this routes file is a little bit of Ruby code. The routes go inside of this do end block, which is part of it's a call to Rails application routes draw. Not sure why the method is called draw. I think in former versions of Rails it was called map, which at least made more sense to me that we're mapping one thing to the other. But it's now called draw. I guess we're drawing out our routes. And it's here we're going to define that idea of sort of what URL maps to a particular controller action, right? So if you recall, we're at the router level, we're consuming URLs, and we're turning them into executable calls to particular actions or methods inside of particular controllers. And so what we have at our disposal inside of this do end block is what's called a DSL, or a domain specific language. And what that just means is it's like it's quite easy to make DSLs in Ruby, but they're present in all sorts of different programming languages, and it's almost like we get like a little programming language that's customized to the domain, and the domain here is the domain of routing. And so we're gonna write what looks like config file here, but it's actually executable Ruby code. So that's sort of a DSL is just another way of like making almost like an executable config file. And so I'm gonna grab from my beer plan here these two lines here where I was sort of planning out these two routes. So I'll copy those two lines and I'll just put them as comments in here, like so and like so. And we're gonna see that these comments are gonna be very close to what I actually want to produce. Domain specific language for routing. Yay. And so to make this route right here, we're saying it's a get request / companies is what's going to trigger this route. So this is the URL or the the verb and the URL that are coming in. So it's always a verb URL pair that comes in to the router. And so I'm going to say a get request to / companies is going to go to, and then inside of quotes, the company's controller's index action. So that's why when I was writing our notes or our documentation, I wrote things like this, because in our DSL, the way we refer to a particular controller and then its particular action is to write the name of the controller and then separate the action by a hash mark. So a get request to /company routes to the company's index action, and then internally and inside of our views, we're going to sort of know this endpoint or know this route as companies. It's going to be the company's route. And then same thing for this route over here. A get request is going to trigger this route, specifically a get request to companies /some ID. And that's why I wrote the placeholder with :ID, because in this domain specific language, that's how we put placeholders inside of our routes, :something. And you know, we could even have a route, and eventually we will have a route that looks something like this, you know, companies ID edit, and that would go to like some kind of editing form. And again, this will just be a placeholder. So when it actually comes into our router, it'll be like /companies1 edit or /companies/2 edit. But here we're just going to be at /companies/ some numeric placeholder. That's going to route to the company's controller's show action. And internally, this will be known as the company. And so, and when I say internally, that within our views, we're actually going to be able to generate links to these things. And this thing is going to be called, we're going to generate links to either the company's path or the company path. So those will come in handy later if we want to auto generate links. And by links, I mean like an A element with an href, and I want to, you know, automatically have it go to a particular one of these routes. I can by name call out the company's path or the company path and have that generated for me inside of a view. Okay, so that sets up my routes. Once those routes are in this file, written out in this domain-specific language, from my command prompt, I can say Rails routes, and that will show me the routes that Rails has available to me. Some of them are system routes that have to do with like when we do file uploads or when Rails can deal with inbound or outbound emails. But if we scroll up to the very top, we're going to see that there are two routes that we've just defined. The companies route, which responds to a get request to /companies and then loads up the company's index action, and then the company route, which is a get request to /company/some ID, and that's going to go to company's show. So that worked. We can also just see this from the server. When Rails is running in development mode, I can do two things. I think I could say like Rails info routes, and I can see those routes, so the system routes, but at the very top, the two routes that we have gone and created. But I can also, yeah, Rails has, Travis has just seen the word Mailgun in there. I think it has sort of built-in ability to deal with Mailgun and SendGrid and all those kind of like mailing APIs. Remember, the idea behind Rails is to take all the things that we commonly do in web development and make them easy. So it's like we often use mailing APIs to send out emails, and so Rails just has endpoints that are set up ready to go for those things. So one way of just seeing these routes is /rails/info/routes. That only works in development mode. You can't do that in production because that would reveal too much information about the system to potential bad actors. Same thing goes for if I just put in a route that doesn't exist. Just do some key mashing and I hit enter. I'm going to get a routing error and I'm going to be able to see those routes. And again, this is something that only exists in development mode. In production mode, this would not happen. My routes are up and running. What that means is that if I go to those routes from the browser, what's going to automatically happen is a get request to /companies, for example, will go to this index action. It's empty, but as I mentioned before, there's like an automatic feature, which is that the view is going to be automatically loaded by way of the name of the action. And so after the controller action executes, the associated view is automatically going to load up. So in our case, after the index view or after the index action executes, it's going to auto magically load the app views companies index.html.erb, and after the show action, Rails will automatically load app views companies show.html.erb. And so what I'll do is I'll modify these views slightly. Inside of the index view, I'm just going to say all companies inside of the H1, and inside of the show view, I will say, without wrecking the markup, I will say one company. And we now should be able to see, even though it's not actually going to load the companies just yet, right? Our controller actions are empty. We can follow this full path. Not going to yet follow into the model, but we can see the browser make the request. It'll hit the router. It'll go to the appropriate controller. It will load up the associated view. That view will be embedded in a layout, and that will be sent back as HTML to our browser. And so away we go. We can, no, not there. I'll go here and I will go to /companies. That's going to be the route that should load up all of the companies. And it says, hopefully unsurprisingly, all companies. And it says find me in app views companies index.html. So that is this view right here being automatically loaded after this empty method executes. And if I go to /companies/ remember our routes, /companies/ some ID, some numeric ID. So if I go to like /1, it'll say one company, but it's going to take any ID right now because we're not going to the database. It doesn't know that these need to be valid primary keys. So I can just put in some big number there and it's still going to say one company. And Adam has asked, will the controller always load these layouts or you can modify it? Yes, you can definitely step in and you can force the controller to render a different layout. So there is a render command that would render a different layout. And we can also circumvent the auto loading of a view by just redirecting elsewhere. So we can redirect to another route after something is done. Currently, letters will work. So I could go to /company/wat. And that'll work as well. If I was really worried about that, I could go in here and I could add a constraint. Let's see if I remember how to do this. Constraint. No, I don't really remember how to do it. I should be able to, in some way, constrain the ID to be like to match this particular regular expression, which is like a decimal regular expression. But how do I specify specifically the ID? Let me just peek into the old routing system here. There is a wonderful routing guide here. I can just search for routing, and then I can search for constraint. Verb constraint, request constraints, constraints. ID. Now let's see if that does it. If that's going to constrain my ID to be. Oh, you want some spacing there? Okay, fine. I can do a little bit of spacing. This is the regular expression for decimal. I guess it should be decimal plus. I think I always remember or forget the difference between a plus and an asterisk, but I think plus is what I want here. And now /company/wat should no longer work. But /company/123 or any numeric value should work. So we have like full control over the matching here. So I can control right down to constraining that the ID needs to match this particular regular expression, which is one or more decimal digit. Now we want to, we're almost out of time, but I can do this. We can fit this in. I need a surge of energy. What do I need? I need to level up right now. Yes, I got it. I've got my energy back, folks. We can do it. We can add to this index here. In the example when we were drawing things out, I talked about the fact that at products is going to load up product.all, and that's going to trigger our select star. So that's what we're gonna put in here. At products equals product.all, so that, you know, we're using our product model to load all products from the database, from the old database. And then this products is going to be automatically handed off to the view, so I don't have to oh no, not products, you're absolutely right, Brody, it's companies that we are dealing with here. I've gotten ahead of myself. So this is companies. We're in the companies controller. Oh, see, that mushroom just messed me up. Company dot all will load up our company model to load all companies from the database. Thank you for that quick catch there. And then, yes, this will automatically be handed off over here, and we can do a little bit of ERB, right? We can go in and we can say at companies.each do company. We can put an end in here. Unfortunately, the lovely endwise extension for VS Code that puts ends in automatically, it doesn't work inside of ERB, so we have to put our ends in manually again. But here I'm going to have maybe I'll just make an unordered list of companies come out. So inside of here I'll have an li, and I will echo out with my percent less than percent equals, the equals meaning the echo here, the company name. So going to my collection of companies, this collection of companies is coming to me by way of the controller, which just got automatically shared with the associated view, and I'm looping through it with a standard Ruby each loop, but it's embedded just like we used to embed our PHP inside of markup. And then it's a mixture. It's this, again, just like our PHP, it's this lovely mixture of executable code and markup. So as we're looping over the companies, we're inserting one li per company. Each one is going to go to that individual company and echo out, because of this equal sign, the name. So we wouldn't want an equal here. If we put an equal here, it's going to echo out whatever's returned, you know, by this each symbol. So sometimes we don't want the equal sign, sometimes we do. It's when we want to echo something out. How does tabbing work for ERB with the nested blocks? Does it just take the first end or finds the or? The tabbing should just work. Like it oh no, it doesn't seem to. But you know, we can manually tab in. So like each block is going to be tabbed in like you would do inside of executable code. Like, so if I wanted to make this a little bit more proper, I might tab it in like that, so that this is nested inside of the UL and the LI. But just like with PHP, the end result that's going to come out into the HTML source code will look a little bit funky. No, Ruby does not. So it's Python that is white space sensitive to know which matches which. Ruby is not white space sensitive, so we don't need to worry about things aligning for it to deal with that. But you're right, within Python, that is a very tricky thing that we always have to think about. And so let's see if this works. And again, we're now traversing this entire loop, right? We're going to go to /companies. It's going to go to the router. The router's going to say, aha, you want the company's controller's index action. That company's controller's index action is right here. We're going to go to the model and load up all the companies. So that's us traveling to the model here. The database is being interacted with the generated SQL. That gets sent back to the controller. Then the controller is going to hand off its instance variables to the view. That brings us to this view right here, where we loop over all of our companies, building LIs for each one of them, embedding the name of each company inside of each LI. And then that view, notice I only have a little bit of HTML here, and it's not the entire HTML document. That's going to be embedded in a layout. And where is that layout? It's in the views layouts folder, and it's called application.html.erb. And just like I promised, it includes a yield, and this is where the view gets yielded in. And you know, I'll show in a moment that we could change the title here. to something that doesn't look so generic like that. But let's try this out. Let's go to our browser. Let's go to /companies, and there are our two companies in all of their glory. My company, Kyle likes beer, so Kyle makes beer, and then my arch nemesis company, we pretend to make tasty beer, but actually our beer is nasty. And so hopefully you only drink beer from this first company, and the second one you need to boycott at all costs. And so we're so close to running out of time, but I really want to put a bow on this when we've done both of these things. This second route included an ID, right? And we're going to get access to that ID inside of show here. So let's quickly implement this. We're going to say we're loading up a company. We're going to the model, and we're going to find, and if you remember, find finds a company by ID, and I have this magical thing called params. And you can just think of it like in PHP, we had that get superglobal and the post superglobal. It's like params is like both combined. And I'm just going to ask it for the ID that is coming from this placeholder right here. So the placeholders that are in our routes, they get to us by way of this param. This will find a company by ID. And then here, inside here, I can actually just now echo out the company.name here, and that's it. That's all that's going to be on this particular and yes, the params works with both the get and posts. So things that come by way of gets are coming in the URL. Stuff that's posted is also going to, and we'll look at that in another lecture, that's also going to come to us by way of params. So we have these two. I can get to, if I go to /companies/1, there's my company, /company/2, that is the other company. And just to make things sort of work all together, I want to actually link. So remember I said I could, by name, I could link to these particular routes. Well, on the show page, if I want to go back home, I'm going to put a little link in here, and I'm going to say link to home, and I'm going to ask for the company's path, because that's what I called this route right here. This route here, this get request to /companies, I called it companies, or the company's path. So on show, I want to build a link for me automatically with link to. And so if I go to my, whoa, look at that, it appeared. There's a home button, and I can click on it. It takes me home. If I want to have links here that take me to these individual companies, this company and this company, well, I can do the same thing in the index. Instead of just displaying the company name, I can link to. The first parameter of link to is the link text. The second is where we're linking to. We're linking to this company. We're linking to that company right here. And link to, what it's going to do is it's going to look here, and it's going to look here for what is necessary to autocomplete this route. Well, what's necessary to autocomplete this route is an ID. And guess what this object has? It has an ID property. And so it's going to pull that ID property, and it's going to make the link for us. And that's going to put a bow on this lecture. We now have links here. I can link to the permalink page for Kyle likes beer, so Kyle makes beer. And then I can go home and I can link to the other company, and then quickly leave that evil companies page and come back to our beautiful list of all companies. I've gone 1 minute over, everybody. Before we go, I see Adam has his hand up. Do you have a question, Adam, before we go?
Yes, so you're referring to company. Is that the object company in the loop, or is that the name you gave the route?
This is the company object in the loop. Very great question. That is the company object in the route. And this is actually the short form. What we're actually doing is we're using the company path and passing it the company object. So that this is the name from the route. But again, it's just so common to do this, to have an object that we pass to this named path, that as long as we name everything sort of the same, so that the object is called company and the path is called company, then the short form is just to pass the object, and Link2 can just sort of figure it out because we're leaning on conventions. And the same thing is actually happening here. We are just explicitly using company's path. So this is the name of the route that we defined right here with the show, with the index here. We get the short form, but we could also have done company path. And just to show you that, you know, I think I could just do this, and then it'll be a little bit more obvious that they are different things. And so if I save that, I should be able to still load this up. The links still work. And maybe it's a little bit more clear here, the difference between one and the other. Here's the object C that I'm passing to the company path. But if everything is sort of named in this sort of unified way, I can get away with just passing the company.